Hey, we're back. Let's try a different format this time, where I skip the editing and just dive into books and see how much content pours out. One reason I started writing book reviews is to motivate myself to put in the work. It just takes so much time and effort to learn about how the world works, to learn about capitalism, geopolitical economy, history, ecology, all the good stuff. There's a part of me that's so inspired to learn all this, and I need to put myself in environments to nurture that side. If you're listening to this, I'm sure you can relate. So, the premise of this episode is to go over books I'm currently reading and why. Many of these books are foundational. Many I've been stuck on for years. Here's the top 2 books. Both of them are on geopolitical economy. Okay, let's start with the first book, Geopolitical Economy, After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, by Radhika Desai. So we can see here that it's published in 2013, 328 pages. Pretty dense. These are pretty dense pages. This is not an easy book to get through. So let's read what it says here. Geopolitical economy radically reinterprets the historical evolution of the world order as a multipolar world emerges from the dust of the financial and economic crisis. Radhika Desai offers a radical critique of the theories of US hegemony, globalization, and empire, which dominate academic international political economy, IPE, and international relations, IR, revealing their ideological origins in successive failed US attempts at world dominance through the dollar. Desai revitalizes revolutionary intellectual traditions which combine class and national perspectives on, quote, the relations of producing nations, end quote. At a time of global upheavals and profound shifts in the distribution of world power, geopolitical economy forges a vivid and compelling account of the historical processes which are shaping the contemporary international order. Now, it's predictable that this is not an introductory book into economics, and the reason for that is there's several layers that it's building on top of. If we look at the title here, we can start with economics, which is a very propagandized field. Over that layer, we have political economy, which is trying to add the political layer back into economics. And finally, we have the geopolitical. The way I think of geopolitical economy is best represented by comparing political economy with the geo part. So I like to use this comparison, which is between Ha-Joon Chang and this book right here, Jim Glassman's Drums of War, Drums of Development. So let me explain this. Ha-Joon Chang is probably one of the most mainstream heterodox economists. Let's see, he teaches at University of Cambridge in the political economy of development. And so his school of economics that he focuses on is development economics. And what he does, if we take a look at some of the books that he's written, you can see these are, pretty well rated for economics books. 12,000 ratings. Now, this is his one of his academic books, probably his most famous academic book, Kicking Away the Ladder: Development Strategy in Historical Perspective. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to challenge the apolitical mainstream economics, which has theories like free trade and free market. So the mainstream economics view is that free trade is good, it's optimal, it brings out the best in everyone. And Ha-Joon Chang's approach with his political economy is he actually brings in the politics and he looks at history. So he looks at how the British Empire developed and he looks at how the United States developed. And both of them used not free trade initially, but protectionism. Not just any protectionism, but strategic protectionism, especially infant industry protection. And the point of that is, if you want to develop your economy and you have strategic sectors that you want to improve on, you can't just let those compete with foreign competitors in the quote-unquote free market, because chances are, if they're underdeveloped, if your industries are underdeveloped, you'll get wiped out. So you have to use strategic protectionism to nurture these industries in their infancy, to get them up to speed. And so that's Ha-Joon Chang's approach, is he looks at history, he looks at the British textile industry, and he looks at how the American industries industrialized. And he points out all the protectionism that they used until they caught up. And then after they caught up, after they became competitive and eventually dominant, then they kicked away the ladder for countries that wanted to develop. So that is the point where they say, no, free trade is great. We're going to do free trade. Everyone should do free trade. The point is they've already climbed the ladder, and others who need to climb the ladder, who need strategic protectionism, were not allowed to have that ladder. And so that is Ha-Joon Chang, an amazing perspective, amazing historical, political, economic lens to understand how countries became rich and how countries became poor. And this is, very much on the economic side. Obviously, economics is tied with violence. So there's not just the economic side, but there's also the military might underpinning it. Ha-Joon Chang focuses mostly on the economic side. And so Kicking Away the Ladder is the academic book, and the popular version of that is Bad Samaritans, The Myth of Free Trade, and The Secret History of Capitalism. Now, this is all great. Ha-Joon Chang, political economy, real-world history. This is a great place to start. However, Ha-Joon Chang has some limitations. So even though, it's quite strange he would have this limitation, because what we just talked about there is imperialism, is colonialism, is power relations between countries. But for some reason, when he talks about how countries develop, he has a certain bias where he still focuses on the national context, the state context. Ha-Joon Chang is South Korean, so he uses South Korea as one of his important case studies. And so he talks about how South Korea wanted to go through industrialization, rapid industrialization. And so on the state level, they did protectionism, strategic protectionism. They did infant industry protection. What is missing in this? So Ha-Joon Chang talks about, all the state policies that they did to facilitate this, the industrial policies. This is political economy. This is on the national level. However, if we look at geopolitical economy on the global level, there was a context to which South Korea was able to do their national industrial policy. And that context was the Cold War. And so with the geopolitical economy lens, we start to notice things like, wait a minute, South Korea didn't just do these industrial policies, these protectionist policies in a vacuum. They did it in the context of the Cold War. And what they received was US military contracts. And so the geopolitical economy lens looks at the relationships between countries, the big picture context. And so what's super interesting is if you look at, for example, how Japan reindustrialized after being bombed in World War II, they reindustrialized not just in a vacuum, but with US military contracts in the Korean War. So while Korea was being bombed, Japan was able to get military contracts as a US ally, and they were able to use those military contracts for their industrial policies. And then when Vietnam came up in terms of the Vietnam War, this is when Japan also got some of the military contracts. But by then, South Korea, which was an ally to the United States, managed to wrangle some military contracts as well. And that really helped South Korea's their industrialization. So that's how I distinguish between political economy of Ha-Joon Chang, when he focuses on, for example, this Reclaiming Development, an Alternative Economic Policy Manual. Or this, the East Asian Development Experience, the Miracle, the Crisis, and the Future. So from my readings of Ha-Joon Chang, his focus is on the national level, and he talks about national policies. Whereas if you take a geopolitical economic lens, then you have to look at the big picture. In Drums of War, Drums of Development, Glassman offers an interpretation of industrialization in East and Southeast Asia that foregrounds Pacific ruling class geopolitical economic maneuvering during the Vietnam War, challenging interpretations that ignore the effects of military violence. So what he's talking about here is the Pacific ruling class. So this is not just a national ruling class. This is a international ruling class, a regional ruling class. Like we mentioned, a geopolitical economy. So this is really focusing on the big picture context of the world economy and also the interactions between countries, not just within countries. And of course, Vietnam War and military violence. So not just looking at economics as everyday goods and services, but also all the other stuff that doesn't make it into standard economic textbooks because they are controversial. So military violence, drugs, these have massive implications in real world economics, and yet somehow they're scrubbed out of a lot of economic theories. Now, we're going to get to this book later because this is actually the second book that I'm currently reading, but let's go back to Radhika Desai's Geopolitical Economy, and let's jump into the table of contents. Okay, so Chapter 1, Introduction, Why Geopolitical Economy? Sections, Getting to Geopolitical Economy, Why Geopolitical Economy Matters Politically, and the plan of the book. We're going to skip Chapter 1 because I already gave you my spiel on geopolitical economy. Chapter 2, The Materiality of Nations, The Liberal 19th Century, Free Trade and Protection in Classical Political Economy, Imperialism in the Mirror of Revolution, and the 30 Years Crisis. So we already covered free trade and protectionism, the debates around that. In terms of classical political economy, we are talking about the likes of Adam Smith. So that book right there, it's cut off here, but it says The Wealth of Nations. And I think that was published in, 1776? And after Adam Smith, there was David Ricardo, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And after Ricardo, there was, of course, Karl Marx, Capital, A Critique of Political Economy, Volume 1. Within classical political economy, there were debates on free trade and protectionism. Desai here is critiquing Ricardo, who his free trade theory was comparative advantage, the idea that free trade benefits both sides. And this is a key critique of a lot of critical scholars, especially Global South political economists. So Desai references Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik. So here's Utsa Patnaik, an Indian Marxist economist. They recently published Capital and Imperialism, Theory, History, and the Present. They being Utsa and Prabhat. Prabhat Patnaik also wrote The Value of Money and some books on Lenin and imperialism. Imperialism in the Mirror of Revolution. So this is talking about the conflicts between imperialism and revolution leading to the 30 Years Crisis, which is, I believe, the 30 Years Crisis of the British Empire, and how the British Empire was falling apart and was overtaken by the US Empire. And this was during World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. So I believe that's the 30 Years Crisis. And we can see that really sets up Chapter 3, the U.S. imperial career. Imperial Republic, thwarted new imperialism, imperial mimesis, so imperial mimicry, dominance through destruction. The United States is willing. Second War, Second Chance. And finally, Bretton Woods, Dominance over Internationalism. So, Desai's critique of her own book is that she focuses a lot on the United States, which is ironic because one of the themes of this book, which we can see in the title of this book, is critiquing this idea of US hegemony, globalization, and empire, in how this is theorized in academia and beyond. Even from liberal mainstream theorists to even leftist theorists, there's this idea that the US empire is hegemonic and that it is almost invincible, and just in a crude manner. And so Desai is taking what I like to think of as a Marxist approach, focusing on contradictions. So her point is that US hegemony, globalization, and empire, these are not so hegemonic. They're not so static and invincible. She wants to show the dynamism of history, the fact that there are alternatives, and that the power of the US empire was never hegemonic, and that there were always contradictions, conflicts. That's the way that Desai is framing it. And so it's funny because of that, because she is critiquing all these US-centric theories, her book becomes very much biased. I wouldn't say biased, but she spends so much time having to cover these theorists that the book is pretty American-centric. So that's the interesting irony. And this chapter really starts it off by going over the start of the US empire, ending with Bretton Woods, which was the US plan basically for post-World War II global institutions, global geopolitical economy. Now, with imperial mimesis, and thwart a new imperialism, what Desai is trying to describe here is how the US wanted to copy the British Empire, but the problem was the British Empire actually had colonies, many, many colonies. And by the time the US empire was rising, there weren't that many colonies to take over. They were already occupied by European powers. And so the United States had to switch to an informal imperialism using economic institutions. And so there are limitations to that. Chapter 4, we have ambition and realities. From World War to Cold War, convertibility and the Triffin dilemma, the confidence game, the Camelot economy, that's talking about JFK, mounting difficulties, the International Financial Intermediation Hypothesis, IFIH, special drawing rights, a foiled Plan B, SDRs, the dollar in the last ditch. So here we are talking about, we're further expanding on the US contradictions with their empire. And when we're talking about things like the inability to use colonies and the need to use informal imperialism, we're talking about, for example, the US dollar. And that's what convertibility and the Triffin dilemma is about, as well as confidence game and the dollar in the last ditch. So we move on to chapter 5, the retrospection of hegemony stability theory. So hegemony stability theory, as well as this hypothesis, these are what Desai critiques as American-centric theories that have this crude interpretation of US hegemony, US empire, and later globalization. So back to chapter 5, varieties of HST, from declinism to renewalism, cosmopolitan Marxism, and finally, Brenner's Geopolitical Economy of Post-War Capitalism. So Brenner here, we are talking about Robert Brenner, an economic historian, a Marxist economic historian, who is very well known for the Brenner debate. And this debate was about the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And we're not going to talk about it here because obviously this is a different time period. We are talking about this right here, the Economics of Global Turbulence, which focuses on post-World War II geopolitical economy. And this is what Desai cites. So for years, the discipline of economics has been moving steadily away from the real world towards formalized axioms and mathematical models with only a precarious bearing on actuality. Commentators seek to fill the gap as best they can, but in the absence of real background scholarship, journalism is vulnerable to the myopias of fashion and immediacy. The deeper enigmas of post-war development remain in either case largely untouched. Bringing together the strengths of both the economist and the historian, Robert Brenner rises to this challenge. In this work, a revised and newly introduced edition of his acclaimed New Left Review special report, he charts the turbulent post-war history of the global system and unearths the mechanisms of overproduction and overcompetition, which lie behind its long-term crisis since the early 1970s, thereby demonstrating the thoroughly systematic factors behind wage repression, high unemployment, and unequal development, and raising disturbing and far-reaching questions about its future trajectory. So the focus here is on a Marxist perspective of capitalism's profitability crisis. So that's what we're talking about here with overproduction and overcompetition. All right, so chapter 6. Okay, it's chapter 6. Nixon's insouciance, Carter's cooperation, Reagan's restoration, the dispendable nation at the end of history. So this further gets into contradictions, trying to deal with what Brenner points to in terms of the post-war crisis of capitalist profitability, and how these different presidents and administrations try to deal with these contradictions. Chapter 7, Globalization. So we have Clinton's choices, from Reichian globalization to Stiglitzian globalization, centrifugal finance, centripetal finance, the geopolitical economy of globalization. Okay, so this further contradictions during Clinton's administration. In terms of Reichian globalization, we are talking about Robert B. Reich, I think? Yeah, Robert B. Reich, who was the labor secretary or something under Clinton. And Robert Reich is basically a liberal progressive economist. Obviously, when he was under the Clinton administration, he couldn't get much done because Clinton was, very pro-capitalist. And so there were a lot of contradictions. But you can see here, the title here, Saving Capitalism. Like, Robert Reich is a reformist, but still useful, a big mainstream platform. And then Stiglitzian globalization. Who is Stiglitz? Joseph Stiglitz. Whoops. So Joseph E. Stiglitz, used to work for the World Bank, and very similar to Robert Reich, with this sort of center-left reform political economy. And what's also interesting is Stiglitz, trying to think off the top of my head, there's a relationship between Joseph Stiglitz and Ha-Joon Chang. Which is, pretty predictable in that sense. They have similar politics and economics. Okay, chapter 8, Empire, ? The imperial economy. The bubble of militarist hubris. The real estate bubble, second time as farce. The housing bubble gets into its stride. The subprime phase. Descent into crisis. Obama's change. So now we're into the Bush era, into the neocon era, and that's why we're talking about military hubris. And this eventually leads to the 2008 financial crisis. And finally, Chapter 9, Conclusion, the multipolar moment. The life and strange afterlife of single power dominance and the multipolar future. And that's a book. One thing that I would like to add is that Radhika Desai is a colleague with Michael Hudson and references Michael Hudson's works. Michael Hudson has written a lot of books. And the one that is specifically relevant here is Super Imperialism, The Origin and Fundamentals of U.S. World Dominance. And it was published in 1972. The first edition was published in 1972, and that was a year after the Nixon shock in 1971. And it's interesting because even though Hudson and Desai are colleagues, they're taking a different perspective, because Hudson's framing here focuses more on U.S. dominance, especially with the U.S. dollar. That's why it's called super imperialism. Whereas Desai's book is countering the framing of hegemony and dominance and focusing more on the contradictions. And they have a podcast in the YouTube channel Geopolitical Economy Report, the Geopolitical Economy Hour. I'm not sure, they were co-hosting it for a while. I'm not sure if Michael Hudson is still a co-host for it, but he still shows up in some of the episodes. The second book that I've been reading for ages now is one that we already mentioned, Drums of War, Drums of Development, The Formation of a Pacific Ruling Class and Industrial Transformation in East and Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1980. Now you can just tell by the title that this is a tome, an academic tome. 720 pages, published in 2018. This is a massive book, and it's really good. Okay, so let's take a look at it. Introduction, From the Drums of War to the Drums of Development. Part 1, we have Theoretical Moorings, Geopolitical Economy, the Military-Industrial Complex, and the Ruling Class. Okay, this is why when we were talking about what is geopolitical economy, I started with this book. Now, the example that I gave about South Korea economic development, it's a nice accessible example. If you want to dive into theory, this is a great place to start if you want to dive into it. So, reconstituting geopolitical economy, we have geopolitical economy and class, geopolitical economy and transnational politics, okay, so the italics here is actually important too. Geopolitical economy and actually existing globalization, methodological moorings of geopolitical economy, strategic relational geopolitical economies of the conjuncture. So this is really picking apart what are we talking about with geopolitical economy. What really helps is the next two concepts of the military-industrial complex and the ruling class. So we have, for Chapter 2, the U.S. military-industrial complex and the ruling class, theorizing war and capitalist class transformation, class fractions and specialists in violence, theorizing the development of the U.S. industrial complex, the concept of the ruling class and the MIC personified, Van Fleet, Bonney, and Comer. So these are three, maybe not stereotypes, but these are three case studies of different members within the ruling class and military-industrial complex, in terms of military, in terms of commerce, and in terms of government, bureaucracy. The ruling class, a unity in diversity. So the synthesis of these different fractions. And from the US MIC to the Pacific ruling class. So how does the US military industrial complex form into the Pacific ruling class? So obviously this is going to involve the countries that we already mentioned in terms of Japan and South Korea, especially those two, but obviously other allies as well. Class structures, colonial dispensations, forms of social struggle. So you can tell, like, this is so good. It's so detailed. That's why it's over 700 pages. If you want to learn about the big picture, but also be rigorous, so not stick with crude theories, which Radhika Desai also picks apart. But if you want to actually dive and get detailed case studies, this is the book. And that's why it takes over 700 pages to explain everything. And so here is where we start to dive into case studies. So part 2, formations of the Pacific ruling class and East Asian industrialization, anti-communism, and the formation of construction states in East Asia. So chapter 3 is Pacific ruling class formation, the United States, Japan, and China. And so the key here is talking about anti-communism and geopolitics in Cold War history. Chapter 4, expansion of the Pacific complex, the entry of the South Korean chaebol. So this, we start talking about Korea, South Korea's development, industrialization, and once again, it's a dive into a case study. Part 3, the Pacific ruling class and regional development, expansion of the Pacific ruling class and authoritarian anti-communist developmentalism. So chapter 5, regional allies and differing developmental paths within the complex, Taiwan, Thailand, the Philippines, and Singapore. Chapter 6, regional mosaic, war hierarchy, and Pacific ruling class formation. And this year, I can see that, there's critiques of other theories, right? One of the critiques here is from Orientalism to modernization to Asian values. So these are other theories. A lot of them are, crude cultural theories. And then conclusion, the drums of development and capitalist globalization. I mean, this is just so good. But it takes so much labor to go through. Now, when I mentioned geopolitical economy is just one step, the author Jim Glassman has recently written an article, a 2024 article, critiquing geopolitical economy in the sense that there are limits. So you can start with geopolitical economy to build the big picture. But once again, if you want to actually dive into what happens in each case rather than staying at this very abstract, generalized layer, then you need case studies and you need other lenses. And so there's a really good academic article called Critical Geoeconomics, Critique of Geoeconomics, or Something Else. This is a nice little article basically updating Professor Glassman's approach. This concludes episode 2. Thanks for all the feedback on the previous episode. There's a lot of experimenting to figure out how to communicate academic content. This time, I thought I could turn on the mic and freestyle through all 60-something books I'm currently reading. And I managed to get through just 2. I am glad that these 2 offer a primer on geopolitical economy. I'm always thinking about the applications of studying nonfiction. In many inspiring biographies I read, it always strikes me how these individuals are caught in the middle of a storm of events, and how they regret not having more time and access to study what they cannot directly observe before making consequential decisions. So I'm always reminded of the privilege and responsibilities of having so much access to academic studies. Now, history can be taught in a rigid manner, where it appears that everything that happened was inevitable. This hindsight bias can be rather convenient for status quo powers, wrapped in the cloak of objectivity and neutrality. Can we instead interrogate history to unearth its dynamism, its constant social struggles, the contradictions and vulnerabilities of hierarchies and violence? These two books offer some tools for us. Now, the next step in my question is application. Yes, we need to be cautious of the sheer complexity of society, and thus the difficulties with prediction, where chance is always present. However, I do think we can have a clearer picture of possibilities and priorities. For example, with wars and genocides, what are the forces that initiate, sustain, and eventually end these processes? What are the material resources needed, from fuel to finance? What are the geopolitical and class alliances needed, the levels of social consent and discontent? Far from inevitability, can we unearth these hidden structures, the struggles, the contradictions, the chance involved? Even with the worst wars and genocides, were there not opportunities throughout these processes for sabotage? These are some ideas that motivate my readings these days. See you in the next episode.